They laughed at my ancient books, called them dust collectors, attic junk. My daughter-in-law joked about selling them by the pound, and my grandson suggested using them as firewood for the fireplace. I didn't respond. I simply went upstairs, opened the drawer, and pulled out a single slim leather-bound volume. Then I called an appraiser. A week later, 3 men in suits and 1 armed guard showed up at my door. Because that dusty nonsense, it was worth more than their entire house, combined. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Myrta Bloom. I was 72 years old, and most days I still brewed my tea at precisely 7:15 a.m., just like I had when I taught at the Cambridge School Library outside of Boston. I had retired a few years earlier, but the rhythms of my life remained stitched to discipline. It was comforting in a quiet sort of way. The structure of rituals, the familiarity of solitude, the hum of silence broken only by the creak of wooden floors and the soft rustle of pages. My house was small but full, not with people, not with noise or clutter, but with memory. Books lined nearly every wall of the downstairs, floor-to-ceiling shelves, some custom-built decades ago, others cobbled together from flea markets and estate sales. The books had grown like ivy over the years, creeping into the hallway, the breakfast nook, even the edges of the kitchen pantry. Old titles with cracked leather bindings, delicate paperbacks with curled corners, linen-bound volumes that smelled faintly of mildew and dust. Every book had its own story, even beyond the one printed inside. Some were gifts from students, others rescued from boxes left on the curb in the rain. I didn't collect them for value. I collected them because they made me feel whole. I never thought of myself as lonely. Alone, yes, but that was different. My late husband, Charles, had passed nearly 15 years ago. He was a gentleman, an economics professor, and he never minded the books. He used to joke that one day I'd build myself a second house out of hardcovers and glue. After his death, the house grew quieter, but the books kept me company. They lined up like old friends, ready to speak if I only reached out my hand. I rarely invited people in anymore. The younger neighbors didn't visit much. Their lives were fast and sharp, full of devices and obligations. I didn't mind. I had never needed many people to feel content. Still, there were moments, usually in the early hours before dawn or late in the afternoon when the sun spilled through the curtains, that I would sit on the old settee in the front room and wonder where everyone had gone. My son, David, lived 2 towns over with his wife and son. They visited occasionally, holidays, birthdays. When the fridge broke once, David sent a repairman instead of coming himself. I tried not to take it personally. Life was busy. People had children, careers, their own tightropes to balance. But the truth was, I missed him more than I let on. I missed being needed. The house had become mine entirely. I decided when it was quiet. I chose which windows to open, which lamps to light. I wore old cardigans and soft slippers and kept a woven blanket on the back of every chair. I fed the birds out front and watched them bicker over sunflower seeds like they were guarding thrones. I made soup from scratch, read historical biographies, and cross-stitched scenes I never framed. The bookshelf in the corner of the living room, next to the fireplace that hadn't been lit in years, held my oldest volumes, the rarest ones, the ones I had never loaned to anyone, not even Charles. Some of them were signed. A few were foreign editions brought back from study abroad students or traveling friends. Others had notes scribbled in the margins by strangers long gone. That corner was mine, entirely, untouched by time, by opinion, by judgment. Sometimes I stood in front of it for no reason at all, just to run my fingers along the spines, to feel the grain of the bindings, the raised print of gold leaf letters. The world could turn, people could leave, jobs could end, but those books remained, solid, real, present. I often thought if someone were to look into my house from the outside, they'd assume I was a woman waiting for something, a visitor, a call, a change. But I wasn't. I was simply being, not suspended in time, but surrounded by it. In a world that no longer knew how to be still, I had mastered the art of quiet. And in that quiet, I was more alive than I had ever been. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning while I was halfway through my crossword and a lukewarm cup of tea. David said their house was undergoing unexpected renovations. There had been a plumbing issue, something about burst pipes, water damage, insurance delays. His voice was hurried but casual, as if asking a favor he expected to be granted without question. He asked if they could stay with me for a while. Just a few weeks, maybe a month at most. I hesitated, but only for a moment. Of course, I said yes. By Friday, my quiet sanctuary had been rewritten. David arrived first, carrying a box and balancing his phone between shoulder and ear. He didn't linger for pleasantries. Then came Clarissa, sweeping in behind him with her structured blazer and rolling suitcase, her eyes already scanning the space as if she were mentally rearranging it. She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek, commented on the smell of cinnamon in the air, and immediately asked if there was room in the fridge for almond milk and her meal prep containers. And then came Brendan, their 12-year-old son, with headphones around his neck and sneakers too bright for the dusty hardwood floors. He glanced at my books like they were wallpaper, meaningless and boring. I smiled, still trying to be welcoming. The guest room became theirs. Brendan took the smaller room upstairs, the one that had once belonged to David. Clarissa asked if they could use the study for Zoom calls. I agreed. I didn't mention that the study was where I kept my journals, my correspondence, the box of old letters from Charles. It didn't seem important at the time, but slowly things began to shift. The kitchen, once a quiet place for stews and late-night toast, became a revolving door of smoothies, loud blenders, and meal kits with tiny plastic packets that piled up in the trash. My blue china teacups were pushed to the back of the cupboard, replaced by tall travel mugs with logos. The linen dish towels were swapped for microfiber ones that dried quickly but felt like plastic. The dining table, once reserved for quiet meals and thick novels, was now home to laptops, cords, and Clarissa's spreadsheets. She called them client decks. I never asked what she did exactly. She worked in marketing or consulting, something that required her to talk often and say very little. At first, I tried to accommodate. I cooked extra. I tidied more often. I smiled when Brendan rolled his eyes or when Clarissa moved my things without asking. I thought if I made room for them, they'd see that I had built a life here, that this wasn't just a house, it was a home and not a temporary one. But they didn't see it that way. Clarissa had a habit of standing in the middle of the living room and staring, arms crossed, as if she were assessing a problem that needed solving. Once, she said, this place would look amazing with lighter walls, maybe some open shelving. I didn't respond. Another time, she picked up one of my older books and winced as dust floated up. You know, there are companies that will digitize all of this for you, she said. You'd save so much space. I wanted to ask her, save it for what? But instead, I nodded and changed the subject. Brendan, in his way, was just a child shaped by his parents. He didn't understand the meaning behind old objects. He saw my rotary phone and laughed. He asked if I still used those discs to play music. One afternoon, I found him stacking some of my paperbacks like dominoes on the floor. I didn't raise my voice. I simply picked them up, smoothed the covers, and put them back where they belonged. David, meanwhile, drifted in and out. He worked long hours, often in the corner of the dining room with earbuds in. He rarely noticed the changes, or if he did, he said nothing. Perhaps he thought it was easier to stay silent. Perhaps he assumed I didn't mind. But I did mind. Not because of the noise, or the clutter, or even the invasion of space, but because of the erosion, the slow disappearance of what had once been mine. My routines, my order, my place. It wasn't hostility, it was indifference. And that was worse. They weren't trying to hurt me, they simply didn't see me. To them, I had become a placeholder, a convenient setting, a backdrop, the woman with the shelf in the corner, the mother-in-law who kept the lights on and the pantry stocked. They didn't ask about the books. They didn't ask about the woman who had spent a lifetime building this house into a world. And I began to realize that the silence I had always cherished could, when filled by the wrong voices, become something else entirely. It could become erasure. It was a Saturday evening when it happened, the kind of evening that used to mean tea and a quiet book, maybe a candle lit on the windowsill. But now the house was different. The air was heavier, punctuated by the sounds of devices, distant phone calls, and Brendan's video games echoing down the staircase. I had cooked dinner, a slow stew with cornbread, the kind Charles used to love, and I set the table for 5. They arrived late, not rudely so, just enough to make their entrance feel separate from the effort I had put into the meal. Clarissa brought in a takeout salad for herself. "Just in case," she said, tapping her phone while glancing at the bowl I had placed in front of her. Brendan slumped into the chair beside me and began scrolling through something on his screen before even looking up. The conversation started with money. It usually did. Clarissa talked about market trends, how someone at her firm had just purchased a second property for tax reasons. David nodded in agreement, only occasionally adding a word or two between bites. I listened quietly, my spoon stirring through warm broth, my mind somewhere else entirely. Then Brendan looked around the dining room, eyes half-lidded with boredom, and said, "Why do you have so many books, Grandma? You know you can just use a Kindle, right?" I smiled politely and said nothing. Clarissa laughed, sharp, quick, like a bark. "Honestly, I've been saying we should donate half of them, or recycle. I mean, who even reads this stuff anymore?" She picked up a small cloth-bound volume from the hutch behind her. "This one doesn't even have a cover. Look at it. It's falling apart." I reached across and took the book from her gently, setting it back where it belonged. It was a poetry collection from the 1920s. I remembered finding it at a book fair during my first year teaching. The spine was cracked, yes, but it still smelled like old ink and time. David chuckled, trying to keep the tone light. "We could probably sell them by the pound," he said. "Make room for Mom's art or something more modern." Clarissa nodded, sipping her flavored water. "Better yet, let Brendan take a few into the backyard. Make a bonfire. Get some use out of them." I don't know what stunned me more, her words or the way Brendan laughed in agreement. Not cruelly, just with the thoughtless boldness of youth. He mimed tossing a book over his shoulder and made a whooshing sound with his mouth. They all laughed, even David. I didn't. Something in me curled inward, like dry paper catching flame. They didn't mean to be vicious. That was the worst part. It was the casualness of it, the thoughtlessness, the easy dismissal of something sacred. They weren't mocking me directly, not with intention. They were simply laughing at what they didn't understand. And to them, these books were nothing but clutter, a relic of someone who didn't know when to let go. I excused myself shortly after, said I had a headache. No one objected. Upstairs, in my bedroom, I sat by the window for a long time. The air outside was cool, and the neighbor's porch light blinked on. I listened to the muffled sound of the dishwasher downstairs, the clatter of cutlery. My books surrounded me here too. They lined the far wall, filled the bedside table, stacked neatly in piles near the armchair. I looked at them the way you look at a photograph of someone you once loved, tenderly, with the ache of recognition. Every one of them held something, a history, a voice, a version of me that no one at that table downstairs had ever known. The girl who stayed up late reading by flashlight, the teacher who carefully selected titles for her students, the woman who found her husband because he borrowed the same volume of Dickinson from the university library. To them, they were just objects, dusty, useless, replaceable. But to me, they were the only proof that my life had happened exactly as I remembered it. And I knew as I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, that something had shifted. Not in anger, not in sadness, but in clarity. They could laugh at what they didn't understand, but they would soon learn that some stories don't fade just because you fail to read them. The next morning, the house was still asleep when I rose. The hallway was dim, the only light coming from the kitchen window where the sun hadn't yet reached. I moved through the silence like someone walking through an old cathedral, slowly, reverently, as though the creak of the floorboards might wake something I didn't want to disturb. I didn't make tea. I didn't toast my bread. I went straight to the stairs that led to the attic. That attic hadn't been opened in months, maybe longer. The door groaned when I pulled it open, a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. I found the string for the light bulb and tugged gently. The weak bulb flickered before settling into a dull, steady glow. Dust hovered in the air like soft snow, and the scent hit me immediately. Old fabric, wood, and paper warmed by time. I had kept everything up here that didn't belong to the main living space anymore. Boxes labeled in my handwriting, stacks of folded linens from decades past, a small rocking chair from when David was a baby, and in the far corner, an old cedar chest. The chest had been a wedding gift. Inside were things I had collected over the years, but hadn't looked at in a long time. Old correspondence, college essays from my students, notebooks filled with my husband's scribbled lecture notes. But beneath those layers was what I had come for, a flat bundle wrapped in linen. I unwrapped it with care, fingers trembling not from age, but from anticipation. And there it was, a leather-bound book. The cover was dark brown, soft and worn at the edges. The spine bore no title, only an embossed design, subtle, almost invisible now. I opened it gently. The pages, fragile and slightly yellowed, crackled faintly as they turned. Inside the front cover, I saw what I already knew would be there, a handwritten note, elegantly penned in ink that had faded with grace. It was a dedication, from author to scholar, dated more than 2 centuries ago. Beneath it, a barely legible signature. I remembered the day I received it. I had been in my 30s, newly appointed head librarian at the school. A retired professor had donated part of his private collection to the faculty, and knowing my obsession with historical editions, he had insisted I keep this one. "You'll know what to do with it someday," he had said. At the time, I thought he was being poetic. Now I understood. I carried the book back downstairs in both hands, as though it were something living. I placed it on the kitchen table, beside my cold teapot, and sat down. The house remained quiet. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, the occasional shifting sounds from upstairs as someone turned in bed. And then I made the call. I found the number online, an antiquarian bookseller I had met once years ago at a lecture in Boston. I doubted he would remember me, but I remembered his name. His store was still open, his business still active. I dialed slowly, each digit deliberate, as if dialing a code rather than a phone number. When he answered, I introduced myself softly, told him I had something that might interest him. I didn't rush. I didn't oversell. I simply described what I had, sparingly, letting the details speak for themselves. He asked a few questions, and I answered. He grew quiet. Then he asked if he could come see it in person. I said yes. When I hung up the phone, I sat for a long time in the silence. I stared at the book on the table. It didn't glow. It didn't hum with magic. It was just a book, resting exactly where I had placed it. But something about the moment felt different. It felt like balance, the kind of balance that comes after years of swallowing your worth, of stepping aside, of letting people mislabel the most important parts of you. The house began to stir. Brendan thudded down the stairs, probably in search of cereal. Clarissa's voice filtered down from the guest room, already on a call, already reshaping the day in her image. But I remained still, a woman with a book, a woman with a quiet plan. It was a Thursday morning when the doorbell rang, a sharp, confident sound that cut through the silence of the house like a clean blade. I wasn't expecting anyone. My weekly grocery delivery had already come the day before, and the mailman usually just left things at the door without knocking. For a moment, I simply stood there, my hand on the handle of the teapot, wondering if I'd imagined it. But then it rang again. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the door, my heart oddly calm, as though something inside me had already been preparing for this. When I opened it, I was met by three strangers dressed in tailored coats and polished shoes, standing in a neat triangle formation on my front porch. The first man stepped forward and introduced himself as Martin Hale. I recognized the name immediately. His voice matched the one I had heard over the phone days earlier. He handed me a business card, though he didn't need to. I already knew who he was. His eyes were alert but not unkind, the kind of eyes that measured things in subtle increments, not just what they saw, but what they sensed. The man beside him was younger, tall and narrow-shouldered, with a black briefcase and a clipboard tucked under one arm. The third, I noticed only after the first two spoke, stood slightly behind them. He didn't say a word. He wore a discreet earpiece and kept scanning the street with the practiced awareness of someone who had seen too much. A security detail. Quiet, professional, not here for threat, just for value. They had come about the book. I stepped aside and let them in. Inside, the house felt different, not because anything had changed. The same shelves lined the same walls, the same curtains stirred in the same soft breeze, but because these men entered it with reverence. They saw the space not as cluttered, not as quaint, but as something meaningful. I led them to the study where the book still sat exactly as I had left it, atop the linen napkin, positioned beneath the filtered light of the window. I hadn't touched it since taking the photographs. Something had told me to let it rest, as if moving it now would disturb something essential. Martin moved toward it slowly, almost ceremonially, and opened the cover with white-gloved hands. He said nothing at first. He read. He turned the pages as though each one might speak. The younger man leaned in beside him, comparing notes with a document he had printed, nodding occasionally. There was a gravity to the way they treated it, as if it were not just an artifact, but a kind of key. After a while, Martin looked up at me and asked if I had ever considered selling it. I told him I hadn't, not seriously, that it had always simply been a part of my life, kept safe, but not pursued. He smiled faintly and said something that stayed with me. Sometimes the world forgets things, but the things don't forget the world. He then began to explain the details, how rare the edition was, how few were in existence, how the signature alone elevated its worth. He told me that institutions had paid six figures for items with less provenance than mine, that collectors would line up for it, that museums would bid quietly but fiercely, and that was when I saw her. Clarissa had come downstairs, phone in hand, her face caught mid-expression as she entered the room. She paused just at the threshold and took in the scene: the men in suits, the leather-bound book, the briefcase, the silence. Her eyes flicked to me, then to the open volume, then to Martin, who had begun explaining the auction process and potential protections for anonymity. She didn't speak, but her mouth parted slightly, as if caught between a question and a correction. David followed moments later, slower, distracted, pulling his glasses from his shirt collar as he stepped in. He frowned at the sight but didn't interrupt. He looked from me to the men and back again, his brow furrowed. I turned my attention back to Martin, who was now discussing logistics, timelines, transport protocols, legal oversight. He assured me everything could be handled with discretion and that I would retain the final say over any agreement. The conversation continued without apology. I offered them tea. They accepted. Clarissa lingered in the doorway for several minutes, arms folded, her eyes darting between our expressions like she was trying to solve a puzzle without the edge pieces. But she didn't ask questions. She only watched, and I said nothing to her. There was a power in that moment, not arrogance, not defiance, just presence. When the men left an hour later, they thanked me with sincerity. Martin shook my hand with both of his and told me he would be in touch within 48 hours. The younger man handed me a folder with a proposal, and the silent guard nodded once before following them out. I stood at the door as they left, the wind tugging softly at the edge of my sweater. Clarissa was still in the hallway, pretending to scroll through her phone, but I could see it, the tension in her shoulders, the questions she hadn't yet figured out how to form. I didn't offer explanations. I simply turned away and walked back to the study. The book was no longer on the table, but its weight remained. After the men left, the house didn't return to silence the way it usually did. It wasn't that anyone made noise. On the contrary, everything became quieter. But it was a charged kind of quiet, like the air before a thunderstorm. I could feel it in the way Clarissa moved around the kitchen, her steps more careful than usual, her voice suddenly low when she answered calls. I could sense it in David, who kept glancing up from his laptop as if waiting for me to explain something. Even Brendan, who normally stomped around like a marching band, was subdued that evening. But I didn't offer explanations. I didn't explain what the visit meant. I didn't tell them about the conversation that followed, the one where Martin emailed me a preliminary estimate of the book's worth. I didn't say that it exceeded not just my expectations, but probably every financial benchmark they had proudly shared at the dinner table. I didn't mention the specific buyers already expressing interest. I didn't say the words museum acquisition or tax-deferred asset transfer. I didn't need to. Instead, I went about my day as always. I watered my violets. I folded laundry. I pulled out a recipe card written in my mother's faded cursive and baked cornbread from scratch. Not because anyone asked for it, not to prove anything, just because I liked the smell of it baking. That night, while Clarissa reheated her own separate dinner and David distractedly poked at a salad, I brought out the cornbread, still warm. I placed it on the table with a small dish of butter and returned to my seat with a novel I'd been reading for the 5th time. No one spoke, but I noticed both of them helping themselves to a piece. It was strange how differently they looked at me now, Not with affection, not with hostility, with hesitation, as if they had walked into a room they thought they knew and realized the furniture had all shifted. They couldn't quite put their finger on what had changed, but they felt it. I didn't enjoy their discomfort. I didn't want them to feel small, but I did want them to understand that I had never been as small as they made me feel. Value isn't loud. It isn't always obvious. It doesn't announce itself in perfect teeth and leather briefcases or real estate jargon. Sometimes value waits in silence. It rests on a dusty shelf for decades. It takes root in memory, in language, in the quiet accumulation of care and time. They had spent weeks walking past those books, mocking their age, questioning their worth, without realizing what they were brushing aside. They had looked at them and seen clutter. I had looked at them and seen lineage, legacy, a map of thought bound in leather and cloth. And now that map had revealed itself. One book, one proof, one key to a larger truth. But they still didn't ask. Neither David nor Clarissa asked about the appraisal or the visit, or the man in the dark coat who hadn't said a word, but whose presence had spoken volumes. They pretended it hadn't happened, but their silence had weight. That silence followed us for days. When I received the second letter, this one from a museum director in New York, I read it in the garden, sitting among the tulips that had begun to open. The museum wanted to place the book in a permanent collection. They would preserve it, display it, insure it. They offered me a sum I would never have dreamed of asking. And more than that, they offered something rarer, a handwritten note acknowledging my role as the book's custodian, a legacy credit, my name beside it for as long as the exhibit remained. I thought about it for 2 days before answering. Not because I hesitated, but because I savored the decision. When I finally accepted, I didn't tell anyone, not right away. Instead, I did something simple. I began to dust the bookshelves, one by one, carefully, slowly. I rearranged some of the titles, not for aesthetic reasons, but because I felt like honoring their order. I brought a few volumes downstairs that had long been stored in the back room. I placed them where people could see them, not because they ever would, but because I knew they deserved to be seen. Brendan passed through the living room while I worked. He glanced at a book I held in my hand, an illustrated field guide to birds in New England. He paused. "You know," he said, "this one's kind of cool." That was all, just those words. And I nodded, just once. Because that's how it begins, with a pause, a second look, a flicker of understanding. They would never see me the way I had seen myself, but they no longer saw me the way they used to, and that in itself was everything. The change didn't come in a dramatic wave. It didn't roar through the house or crack the foundation with a single strike. It came quietly, the way autumn slips into summer. The air shifted, the tone softened, and one by one, the balances began to tip. It started with the glances. Clarissa no longer looked me in the eye with that sharpness she once carried. She had always spoken with the tone of someone gently correcting a mistake, as if I had simply not caught up to the times and she was there to help. But now she paused before speaking, gauging my expression, her words slower, more tentative, as if calculating how much I already knew. David became more present. He lingered longer in doorways. He offered to carry things without me asking. He asked questions about dinner instead of assuming I would make it. I caught him one morning standing in the study, looking at the now empty space where the leather-bound volume had been. His hand hovered over the napkin I'd left behind, folded and clean, as if even the absence of the book still commanded respect. They didn't ask where the book had gone. They didn't need to. They had overheard just enough, noticed just enough, and guessed the rest. And now they moved through my house like careful guests, no longer entitled residents. I had not scolded them. I had not demanded anything. But somehow, without raising my voice or setting a single rule, the rules had changed. The study, which Clarissa once used freely for her endless meetings, became mine again. I found it empty one morning, the chair turned in, her laptop gone. She didn't return to work there, and I never questioned why. The kitchen, which had been overtaken with protein powders and prepped meals, began to regain its rhythm. My teacups were back at the front of the shelf. The blue and white china returned to the drying rack after I washed them, no longer shoved behind someone's tall coffee tumbler. They noticed, but said nothing. They let it happen. Even Brendan shifted. He no longer played his music without headphones. Once, I heard him ask his mother if he could help me carry groceries from the car. He hadn't asked me directly, but I heard him, and that was enough. Later that evening, he sat beside me on the sofa and looked at one of the books I'd placed prominently on the table, a children's atlas, one I'd read to David when he was 7. Brendan didn't laugh at it. He didn't roll his eyes. He just turned the pages, quietly. Clarissa didn't try to organize my shelves again. She didn't comment on the dated curtains or suggest repainting the walls. I saw her looking at the books sometimes, not with curiosity, but with caution, as if she had begun to suspect that there were things in this house she could no longer categorize or dismiss, things that had power simply because they had endured. The emails from Martin kept coming, updates about the exhibition planning, a tentative date for the unveiling, the logistics of shipping the book to the museum's preservation wing. I responded to each message with care, and I saved them all in a folder marked Legacy. I didn't print them, but I considered it. One morning, David asked if I needed help with any paperwork for taxes. I thanked him, but declined. He didn't push. He didn't ask what I meant by "it's already being handled." He simply nodded. That was when I realized it. The power had shifted, not because I had seized it, but because they had finally realized it had always been mine. They had moved into this house assuming I would bend, that my habits were quaint and my presence optional. They had treated me like background, useful, quiet, soft. And I had played that role for a time because it was easier to be unseen than to argue. But once the silence was filled with meaning, once the book had spoken louder than any confrontation ever could, they had no choice but to adjust. Their posture changed. Their language softened. Their laughter grew more restrained. This wasn't victory. I wasn't gloating, but I was reclaiming. Every time I made tea in the kitchen, they now entered with measured steps. I reclaimed a piece of my place. Every time Brendan asked about a book instead of mocking it, I reclaimed dignity. Every time Clarissa bit her tongue when she passed a shelf she used to call dead weight, I reclaimed my voice, and none of it had required a single raised word. The power of silence is that it makes people listen harder when they finally realize you've stopped speaking. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something else. They began speaking to me differently, not just with caution, but with something closer to care, as if they had started wondering what else I had kept quiet about, what else I knew, what else I held. And in a way, they were right to wonder. Because my house had always been more than shelter. It was a history, a vault, a quiet kingdom built on words and time and memory. And now, without asking permission, I had taken the throne. The morning the contract was finalized, I made breakfast slowly. The sunlight had just begun to stretch across the counters, warming the worn ceramic tiles that had seen more memories than most people ever do in a lifetime. I cracked 2 eggs into a bowl, stirred them with salt and pepper, and let the pan heat while the house remained still. No noise from upstairs yet, no rushing footsteps, just the calm, familiar sound of a home that had finally remembered itself. I had signed the agreement the day before. It arrived in a thick envelope, sealed with weight and intention, from the museum's acquisitions director. The pages were printed on ivory stock, and the final signature line waited for me at the bottom, not in the center, but to the right, like they knew exactly where my name belonged. There was a formality to it, yes, but also a respect, a reverence I hadn't felt in years. After I signed, I sat with the document for a while, my fingers resting lightly on the edge. There was no rush to mail it back, no urgency. It was already mine. Later that afternoon, I walked it to the post office myself, wrapped in a manila envelope I sealed with 3 strips of tape, not because it needed that much, but because it felt ceremonial. I handed it to the clerk without a word. She didn't know what it was, and that made it better. She handled it casually, but I knew better. It wasn't paper, it was legacy. The museum had offered a generous sum, one that could have turned heads at any bank, but I had refused the lump payment. I had asked for it to be structured differently. Some for me, yes, enough to keep me more than comfortable, but the rest set aside for scholarships, for school libraries that had suffered from neglect, for literacy programs, for young readers who needed to believe that stories mattered. I didn't tell Clarissa or David any of this. I didn't tell them about the museum's plans for a national exhibit. I didn't tell them that the first plaque would include my full name beneath a photo of the book, or that the catalog would include an essay I'd been asked to write. They would find out eventually, probably from someone else, probably with surprise. That was how I wanted it. I wasn't angry anymore. The hurt had burned away like fog under sun. I felt something steadier now, like standing on bedrock after years of loose gravel. That night, I heard them whispering in the hallway. Brendan had apparently told one of his classmates that I was famous now, and Clarissa had asked, not entirely joking, what that meant. I could hear the stiffness in her tone, the part of her that was still piecing together how everything had shifted without her notice. I didn't intervene. I let them talk. The next morning, Brendan came down early. He didn't ask for cartoons or cereal. Instead, he sat at the table while I sliced fruit and asked if I had any more cool books. I handed him a small volume about trees in the Northeast. He flipped through it slowly, carefully, like it might disintegrate if touched too hard. I didn't hover. I just let him read. That afternoon, a letter came from a school in Pennsylvania. They had received their grant, a small one, but enough to restock their library shelves. The principal had written me a handwritten note. She said the students cried when they saw the books arrive. I cried too, quietly, in my study, where no one saw. Later that evening, David entered the room and stood silently in the doorway. He didn't ask anything. He just looked at me, like he had something to say but couldn't quite find the words. I closed the folder I was reading and nodded to let him know I saw him, that I always had. He turned and walked away without speaking, but it was enough. Clarissa stopped making comments about the house. She didn't redecorate. She didn't criticize. She just moved through the rooms now like someone trying not to disturb the walls. And as for me, I didn't change much. I still brewed my tea in the morning. I still watched the light fall through the lace curtains, but something in me had settled. Not like dust, like stone, like truth. They had laughed once, called my books outdated, my shelves useless, my passions sentimental. But now those same shelves held power, not because of what they could be sold for, but because of what they meant. Stories can be burned, but the right one, the right story, refuses to die. It returns in letters, in ledgers, in signatures on ivory paper. It survives in footnotes and photographs. It sits in glass cases with small lights pointed directly at it, while visitors lean close and whisper. And now, no one in this house could erase mine, because I had written it quietly, line by line, in the spaces they never thought to look. And now it lived, forever bound, forever named, a story they would never burn again.